Hello, this is Dr. Jared Schurz, and welcome back to our series on depression. If you've been taking these in order, this is part 8. This is a specialty engagement on the use of medication. If you haven't taken the other engagements, you're going to be at a bit of a disadvantage because the theme or the foundation upon which understanding depression to make that decision about whether medication is needed or not is not going to be there. So I would encourage you to take the others, but I understand this is an important decision that people come to around depression, because when people are suffering and you feel like you don't have the energy or the hope to keep going, medication becomes a real concern and a big choice that people make. It's important to understand, again, that depression is a commonly used term, and it's sort of a catch-all for lots of different ailments. We talked about the difference between malaise, dysthymia, grief, sadness. Medication is really only for people who are experiencing moderate to severe depression. And that's a pretty serious condition in which people are just not functioning well. However, for those of you sort of in that gray area where you're unsure, hopefully this will be of help to you. Because of the term's use and misuse, depression is oftentimes misunderstood. And as we tend to rush to a decision around whether or not there's illness or mental illness or a behavioral health issue, we tend to look for remedies rather than really trying to understand the nature of the problem. And that's because we live in sort of a quick fix society where we want to find answers. Let's take that into consideration, because really understanding the nature of the problem is what helps us to figure out what to do about it. So let's consider changing disease, and let's hyphenate it to dis-ease. When we do that, we're recognizing that we're still suffering, but it's not necessarily and entirely a medical condition or an illness as we might think it is. It doesn't mean that there's not a biological or genetic or physiological component, but it means we want to consider that our suffering has lots of different components and influences to it. Medication is really about treating symptoms. That's the important thing to know here, because if the symptoms, which remember we defined as messages from the body, ways of our body telling us that needs aren't being met, if those symptoms are treated, meaning that we're lessening the symptom, we're lessening the intensity of the message, we're not necessarily going to understand what our body is trying to tell us and what needs have to be met. And that's the real disadvantage of taking medication. Depression is much more complex than the blues, and those suffering from depression simply can't choose to be happy. So that's an important distinction that we have to make. But despite its complexity, people suffering from depression do get well, and they do get well both with medicine and without medicine. Therapy really ought to be someone's first choice, psychotherapy, because you want to use the least invasive approach first, something that's not going to alter your body chemistry. When something doesn't work, then you look to necessarily go up the ladder of intensity. The challenge is determining the physiological and sort of psychological mixture of factors. How much of this is about my brain chemistry or about my genetics, and how much of this is about my paradigm, my flat energy, the way I'm getting my needs met, which is what this series has been about thus far. Hormonal, neurochemical, metabolic contributors, those are all legitimate aspects of depression. There are people who have thyroid problems. There are people who have neurological issues. These are all very specific conditions that generally indicate medication a little bit more quickly. So for those of you who are suffering or know of someone who's suffering from something more specific, that's going to take you down a little bit of a different path. However, let me just give you a little bit of appreciation that our neurotransmitters, the serotonin, the dopamine, the norepinephrine, 95% of those neurotransmitters are produced in the gut, in our bellies. That's where they're produced. So if we're not eating well, we're not handling stress well, that's going to affect how our neurotransmitters are produced. So rather than going really quickly into changing our brain chemistry through medication, let's first consider some of those more organic treatments, because that can be an incredibly powerful way of treating depression in a more organic manner. It's also important to remember that getting well is a process, and you shouldn't attempt to take everything in one sitting. You're not going to be a master of depression. You're not going to have all the answers. You're going to start to scaffold the information. You may have to watch it over and over again to absorb all the different nuance that comes with understanding depression. You didn't come depressed in one day, you don't become cured in one day. That's why medication is a little bit misleading, because anything that works that quickly, even if it takes 3 or 4 weeks to enter your system, right, there's something to that that should say to you that something isn't being solved. You're just treating symptoms. It's important that you develop an understanding of how you became depressed, and then understand the feelings and the experiences that we talked about associated with needs not being met, because that's going to be the driving force that ultimately leads to long-term happiness. With self-awareness, how the problem came to be, we're going to be more equipped to find solutions. Depression is always, however, a combination of genetic and biological, familial, and environmental factors, and depending on your individual background, depending on the influences in your life, you're going to be more or less prone to depression. For example, a person who has a real strong family history, who has got some metabolic issues, right? They've got some strong health problems, they might be more inclined to depression. But realize that that person is also going to be seeing a physician, and the person that we talk to is going to see life through a certain lens. If you talk to a physician, they're going to want to treat you with medication. If you talk to a therapist, they're more likely to want to help you with talking. So always consider the source and the advice you're getting, because people give advice based on their expertise and their lens. We always want to be appreciative of that baseline, however, that there are elements of biology and genetics that we just don't yet understand, that over time we're going to do a better job of appreciating. And all of that is the hidden area that makes us want to become our own expert, because rather than relying on someone from the outside who believes they know it all about depression, it's better that you educate yourself and you become a good consumer, because no one has all the information. It's a very difficult question to answer, and our resiliency and our fortitude to handle distress, those are going to be the areas that you want to put work into, because that's where you have the greatest volition, and that's where you're going to get the greatest long-term results. Some people can tolerate more distress than others. That's just natural for human beings, right? We recognize that, but those are, again, all things that we can work on. An endogenous depression, that's one that's more biological in nature. A melancholia, that's the term used to describe an endogenous depression. Sometimes we call that melancholia. That's a term used to describe the type of ailment that's more based on physiology. Again, it's very hard to accurately diagnose that, but you're going to hear that term. I just want to make you aware of it. It doesn't necessarily mean that a person has all of the answers to decide if it's endogenous or if it isn't. Ultimately, it's important to consider medication as a last resort. That's really the most important thing I want you to walk away with. That if you can tolerate your distress, if you can endure the discomfort that's coming with the depression, try to make medication an only as needed, or something that you look to after you've tried other steps, because you're not going to be as aware of your body, you're not going to be able to pay attention to the needs and how to get them met, and you're not going to feel a greater sense of fulfillment or satisfaction. You're going to feel dependent on the medication, and that's not something that you want. That's really only a last resort. If you're not sleeping, you're not eating, you're in danger of harming yourself, and the suffering is just too great, then that's when you're going to consider your depression. But ultimately, you want a sort of a combination approach. Remember, you want to be your own best expert and enlist the help of other people, whether it's spiritual, whether it's psychological, whether it's medical, massage, nutrition. Get a team of people working with you, because we're complex human beings and there's rarely one cause for anything. Hopefully this was helpful to you. Thank you.